All right, here we go. We're in week 8, Thursday. We're in chapter 6, Tidal, and we're going to try and get a little bit farther in that, get Tidal knocked out here. Not really anything going on right now. You guys should be working on summary 3. That should be coming up here. You can see where it's in week 7, but it's not actually due until next Tuesday. By now you should have all your data collected and be working on your spreadsheets. If you're not sure how to do the spreadsheets, review the lecture that Brad posted up in week 7 on how to use Excel for your energy problems, and the summary 3 overview, which will show you how to do that. And then of course, obviously, if you have any questions, you can email me or Brad or come see us, however that works out, whatever works out best for you. So with that, we're going to jump right into Tidal. And I talked on Tuesday a little bit. I apologize. The lecture from Tuesday on Tidal is not up here. We had a computer glitch and the thing locked up, and we lost the lecture and we lost the notes with no way to recover it. So hopefully today will work a little bit better. But we talked about Tidal and how much energy is in it, and I had talked a little bit about a bay up in Canada, and I couldn't remember where it was. Well, it's the Bay of Fundy, and we've got a video of it here on YouTube, and this is a time-lapse video, but it's a 45.6 foot tide, so pretty amazing. Every 6 hours you got 45.6 feet of water moving. Now that varies a little bit. Obviously it's not always 45.6, but it's somewhere in that, it's a 40-foot range at least, which is pretty substantial. And one of the reasons this place is so crazy is because of where it's located at. It's in New Brunswick, Canada, and the location is just perfectly lined up, and then the shape of the bay itself actually funnels down, so it captures a lot of water and then retains that water. So there's a pretty substantial tidal bore that comes out of there and a lot of energy. But we'll take a look at the time lapse and see what that looks like. So you can see here the tide's going out, and we're at pretty much just about, there's low tide. And you can see the water start coming back in, and all the people running around on the beach. And remember, from that time where it's extended all the way out to the time right here where it's at high tide is about 6 hours roughly between each tide cycle. And then here goes the tide back out, and that's about a 12-hour time lapse to show that, to give you a perspective of how much that changes. And then there's one other one in here. Let me find it real quick. It shows the harbor. This is Hall's Harbor. You can see there's low tide. The boats are all sitting in the mud next to the pier. There comes the water in. Here, one of the other videos that we were watching a little while ago shows that there are places where the tide goes out 3 miles, where you can walk 3 miles out on basically mud flats to get to the edge of the water, and yet when the tide comes back in, that'll be under 30 or 40 feet of water in that same area. So there's quite a bit of energy contained within that water. We talked about energy density of water compared to air, and the fact that there's 1,000 times more energy density in water than there is in air. So we're talking, if we have a wind turbine catching air that has, 100-foot blades, a wind turbine, a water turbine, 1,000th of that size, would capture the same amount of energy from the water, just because of the difference in energy density. So we kind of left off at section 6.6, page 265, and we were talking about tidal barrages, and the idea of it acts kind of like a dike or a dam that water comes in, flows over the top of that dam, and because we deal with tide cycles that are 6 hours, 6 hours tide coming in, 6 hours tide going back out, roughly, it ends up being a very peaky power supply. And because it's not exactly 6 hours, and that does vary, if you look at tides, we have a high tide, we have a low tide. We have a high tide, and we have a low tide. And those times don't necessarily line up with our power. Where I can generate power is right here in the middle. This is where the current is strongest. I have current here. This is coming off a flood tide, so this would be the electricity there. This would be the water going out from shore, and I can capture that. These areas here are slack tides. Which means the water is not really moving anywhere. It comes up to high tide, and there's a period of half an hour or an hour where the water is not really doing anything. It's just kind of sitting there, hanging out. Then it'll start flowing back in the other direction. So I don't have any electricity generation during these times. If I have just an open turbine, out in open water, and I'm just counting on the tide to go by. Those times are worthless, but I can generate electricity there. I can generate electricity here. I can generate it here. I can generate it here. But these peaks and valleys are kind of difficult for me to work with, and that's something that the tidal barrages kind of help out with. If I have my tidal barrage, just looks like a dam or a dike, and here's my water out here coming in, and then I have a bay or a lagoon in here. What I want to do is capture the water behind here, so when the water goes back out, I have a difference in height. Well, what does a difference in height give me? Yeah, I've got potential energy, right? If this water on this side is higher than the water on this side, whatever this distance is right here, that's my head. So if I can create an artificial head by this water being trapped back here, as the water goes out, I can put a turbine inside this dam. I've got my little nifty blades on my turbine here. As the water flows in, or water flows out, as I control the flow out, I can run it past this turbine and capture that energy because of that difference. I can do it I can make that reversible so it goes in the same direction as the tide is coming, as the water level outside goes up and the tide's coming in. I can capture that water coming in, run it through the turbine in the other direction, and generate electricity that way. So what happens is, instead of having my water level is not going to look the same as it does up here, and we can actually see this. This is in a figure 622. You'll see how by using that barrage, I can kind of control this a little bit, and I end up with an area like this. And of course, I'm going to still have my slack time, but I've moved my slack time to here where the water level is equal between across this barrage. If the water level is equal, obviously there's no potential energy there because I don't have head in either direction. So it's going to be neutral, and that works just like my slack tides on this top picture. So basically what we're doing is kind of by using a barrage, we can manipulate to get more useful energy out of it, but it's not ever going to be constant. Like when we talked about hydropower, and if I have a dam in a river, that's a pretty constant flow, and we're not dealing with tides, so there's really the only variable is high water if I have storms or something like that, or low water in a drought. But for the most part, if I control that with a reservoir, which is what we do with our hydroelectric dams, by having a reservoir up there, I can have a constant ready supply of water, and that does away with all these peaks and valleys that you see with tidal. So that's something that we have to overcome, and one of the ways that they look at doing that is using these tidal barrages. Some of the difficulties is we just look there at the Bay of Fundy. We start talking about how much water do we need to be able to do that, and how big of a tide. And on Tuesday we had talked about that we needed, typically for this to be economically advantageous for us, we needed about 15 feet of tide. Well, when we talk about solar electricity and solar PV and how, man, those people at the equator got it made because they get like twice the electricity as the rest of the world out of their solar panels. This is where the trade-off occurs. The farther north you go, the better, the more tide you get, or the farther south. The further away you get from the equator, the more extreme the tides are. So right at the equator, the difference between high tide and low tide can be as little as 6 inches. But if you go to Canada, where we just looked at the Bay of Fundy on those videos, you're looking at a difference of 45 feet. So that's a lot of potential. Typically, in looking at a map, you're kind of looking at the northern United States, probably at the level of the Great Lakes or farther north. Seattle, Puget Sound has pretty close to a 15-foot tide. Some places in Oregon, the Columbia River is pretty close to a 15-foot tide, but that's kind of maybe the cutoff line. It's probably about where the Columbia River in Oregon is, and then on the East Coast, probably closer to Boston, or maybe even a little bit farther north than that. Yeah, you may have to even get up into Maine to get that same equivalent 15-foot tide. So right off the bat, we're kind of limited in the locations that we can do it. And then we also talk about the economics, and we talked about this a little bit on Tuesday, in the location of it, what harbor are you going to put this in? Can I put one of these in Boston Harbor? Well, if you look at figure 617 on page 254, you can, but two things happen. One, just physically to build one is a huge structure. If you think about blocking off Boston Harbor or Puget Sound, think of structurally how much that would take. You're talking about miles of open inlet that you need to dam up completely and block off. You're going to have to put in locks because you have ship traffic going in and out of there. And some bays are not even feasible for that. If you look at the Port of San Francisco, it would actually be kind of ideal right where the Golden Gate Bridge is, because it necks down, natural features force that water pressure to be much higher. But there's so much ship traffic going in that the locks couldn't even handle the amount of ship traffic coming in. So if it's a busy, active port, it's not really feasible. So now you're stuck with a place that doesn't really have any infrastructure as being the only feasible place to do it. But the biggest trade-off for sure on these would be the financial, because the infrastructure required to build one of these things. Talking about the economics of it, The other issue we run into here compared to a hydroelectric dam, you're using fresh water, which it has its issues, but is not nearly as damaging as salt water. So your equipment life is going to be much less, and maintenance and replacement is going to be much higher. The other thing is we talked about hydroelectric dams, and what was you remember what their capacity factor was on that? It's pretty low. I mean, even that great big one we saw that's between Paraguay and Brazil was only about 75% capacity factor, which means despite what the capacity is, it's only really operating 75% of the time, or producing 75% of the capacity that it was designed to produce. And we would consider that fairly low for availability. But in what we just looked at here with these diagrams that we drew out, and looking at figure 622, we're going to have a real issue with capacity factor in the tides as well. That there are going to be times where it's just not generating electricity. So we're looking at a much lower capacity factor. And remember, we figure in how do we figure our economics of it, of whether or not it's viable. In order to determine, we need to know how many kilowatts we need to know that. We need to know the lifespan. And we need to know how much it costs. So if we figure out the thing lasts 30 years and it costs $30 billion, which is not unrealistic for some of the things some of the grand scale projects that we're talking about here, we know it needs to produce $1 billion worth of electricity a year. Well, at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, how many is that?
A lot.
That's a lot of kilowatts that you need to be able to generate in order to do that. Well, if I'm running 100% capacity, that cuts way down on it. Now, if I'm talking 50% or 30% capacity, which is the actual time that it's running, it really has to produce a lot of electricity in the short span of time that it's running, which is just going to drive up the cost. So that's where we're looking at the economics of it. Table 6.1 kind of tells us a little bit of how they work. We'll take a look at that first one there. The Cardiff Weston Barrage has an installed capacity of 8,640 megawatts, which is actually pretty impressive when you think about it. Once again, we're talking about this barrage capturing water. How many of the wind turbines out of Judith Gap, how big are those things in megawatts? They're 5 megawatts for one of those wind turbines. So this thing is the equivalent of, it's way more than the equivalent of Judith Gap wind farm in a much smaller area because you're capturing water. And we can actually figure that out real quick if I can find my calculator on here. So that one is 8,640 megawatts divided by 5, which is what our wind turbines around here are, most commercial wind turbines. Yeah, it's that one barrage is the equivalent of 1,728 wind turbines. Yeah, that's huge. That's why we're looking at the energy density of water, going, hey, let's play with water instead of wind. It's a lot easier. So if you look at the energy generated, 15.6 terawatt hours per year. So we're way out of the kilowatt hours, obviously. And 1 million. 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 1 million And their cost is in pounds. We're not even really going to mess with that very much. You can see there's quite a bit that we can there's quite a bit that goes into these, but there is absolutely energy to be captured. They're talking about down there at the bottom of page 263, 30 billion pounds. So remember when I said if we expected something to last for 30 years and cost $30 billion, they were kind of spot on right there with our estimates of how much that might cost to make something like that. And they say right in there that might not be the best use of money. So it says right in there. A lot of people looking at it saying, wait a minute, it's significantly more expensive on a pounds or dollars per megawatt hour basis than any other major energy production option. But what's the advantage of doing tidal compared to doing hydroelectric?
It's a natural resource.
Yeah, it's a natural resource that should be captured. We have the option of capturing. It's very dependable. As long as we have a moon, it's going to happen. It's not impacted by droughts or anything. It does have some environmental impacts. You would have to look at each one individually to see what that trade-off is of whether or not it's worth it or even feasible. But you might have less trouble keeping a tidal lagoon underwater a little bit longer each day than you would flooding out Rattlesnake Canyon to put a hydroelectric dam in. That's kind of what we're looking at. As far as renewable, that's great. We're looking at it the same as wind, same as solar, same as a lot of these other ones that we're looking at. They're not generating any CO2. They're not using any fuel, which is awesome. But obviously building them, and we looked at what is the infrastructure and just the actual physical structure to build a tidal barrage is huge. And obviously there's going to be all that heavy equipment's putting out there's all kinds of environmental impact there. But it's not too bad. Actually, looking at the one, they actually did a study on that at the bottom of page 264. Next to the last paragraph, they talk about the carbon balance. That the carbon dioxide produced making the materials of the barrage was 2.42 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated. So the carbon payback time on that was only about 5 to 8 months. Which means, yeah, you're generating CO2 by the materials used and the construction of it. But payback time, because now I'm not burning coal, is only 5 to 8 months. That's very short. And it's also, if you do the math on it for wind turbines, it's actually about the same as it is for wind turbines. That's one of the things that comes up. People talk about the production of wind turbines. They talk about the production of solar PV and the actual industry involved in making those. Wind tends to have a faster CO2 payback than solar does, but they're all fairly short, 5 to 8 months. That's actually very similar to what wind is. And I'm not sure, solar is probably a couple of years because it produces so much less electricity. But then again, it's a whole lot smaller, so the footprint to produce it is smaller as well. Right. Yeah, so as far as compared to other technologies, it's actually pretty decent, pretty short return time. And if you read the top paragraph there on page 265, though, if it avoided the emission of 5.5 metric tons of CO2 per year compared to the combined combustion gas turbine, electricity generation would only represent a 0.92%, so less than 1% reduction in UK carbon emissions. So it's small, but then again, how many of them are you going to put up? And if each one does 1%, you know, it does make a difference. It all adds up, and that's kind of what we're finding with renewables as you look at them. Not one of those technologies is going to save the world, but if you start adding them up in little pieces here and there, it really adds up. So they say that's a relatively small savings for an estimated outlay of 30 billion pounds or more. I don't know, ask somebody without oxygen how much they'd pay for some clean air.
Oh, yeah.
So it adds up. You can't put a price on something when you don't have it. So some of the potential projects, and we're talking about the UK here, haven't really seen any in the US so far. Not on a large scale like they talk about there. Talking about, and if you look at the UK, they're kind of right even with Maine. They're about the same latitude as the northeastern United States. So they're kind of borderline in that tidal range where they can utilize it well, effectively. Let's see. If they used every practical UK scheme, they could produce about 53 terawatt hours per year. They're about 14% of the UK electricity generation in 2010. Well, if you remember, when we did week one, when we did that computation on coal and how much electricity was provided by coal each year, it was about 30% of the world's demand. Well, if we use that on a smaller scale, we can figure UK uses 30% as well of coal to generate their electricity. So literally half of their coal use would be eliminated if they were to use every available tidal barrage. So approximately 90% of that is in 8 large sites, and the remaining 10% would be in 34 small sites. So as you can see, it's limited in where it would work best. They've done a lot of research in it, and again, it's great where it works, and obviously some places work better than others. Worldwide, if you look at the tidal power, globally, 3,000 gigawatts. That's fairly useful. You know, we could do something with that, but how much of it is recoverable? Study in 1992, realistically expected recoverable resource is 100 gigawatts. So kind of like wind, we do have wind everywhere. Some places is capturable, some places is not. So at best, realistically, we could do about 100 gigawatts out of that 3,000. But even so, that's still a lot of energy that's not coming from some other source. Russia, USA, Argentina, Korea, Australia, France, China, and India, which notice they're all away from the equator, have some ideal locations where that would really work well. There are a couple small projects in Canada, Russia, one in France. South Korea has quite a bit, though. So table 6.2 kind of shows what they have. South Korea has 2 of them, 0.836 terawatts and 1.2 terawatts. Remember we talked earlier, and I told you we weren't sure what it was, but the hydro dams, we considered 75 to be really, really good capacity factor. Look at these. 24%, 22%, 30%, 34% 34 is the highest one, and that's in Russia. 34% capacity factor. So if we look back at our little figure here that we did with the slack tides and the barrages and how we capture it, that tells you how much we're losing in this little area right here. That's how much energy we're losing. We're down to 34% at best. So we'll take a look at Tidal Lagoons 6.7 on page 269. This is kind of a little bit better because it doesn't really, I guess it kind of works like a dam, but it's a little bit different. Again, you're capturing energy in both directions, but it's controlled. Kind of building your reservoir instead of in a canyon on shore, you're building it out in the ocean, which would get you away from the harbor issues, because it's going to have to be somewhere where the water is fairly shallow to be able to do this, structurally, to build something like this. We definitely have the technology, though. If you look at Japan being able to build an island just to put an airport on, if they can build an island big enough for an international airport, we can definitely build something like these tidal lagoons.
It's using the tide for pump the reservoir instead of using the pump that's using the reservoir to
Exactly.
water. We're just using the tide.
Yeah, so the filling of the reservoir to create that head, that's all you're doing really, is you're creating reservoirs so the tide goes out around it, the water stays in it, and now you have a head and you can capture that difference. So it says here that U.S. company, Tidal Electric, been looking at potential sites in Alaska, Africa, Mexico, India, and China. Looking at a 1,000 megawatt project in India. So there are definitely some sites of it. Talk about some of the disadvantages there on page 270. That the entire containment wall has to be constructed, whereas we talked about a tidal barrage, you're just damming off a tidal lagoon. So 90% of that is just natural shoreline or more. It's just natural shoreline that acts as your containment for the water. Whereas here, you're talking about building a dam around the entire thing. So instead of 90% of it being natural features, now 100% of it is man-made structure. So obviously that would be pretty expensive to do. Talks about here, as we've been talking all along, thought was given to, well, maybe we could put them along the shoreline and use the shoreline for a portion of the containment rather than a man-made structure. But now you're dealing with mud flats, tidal flats, and now you're back into the environmental issues that may not be out there with a structure that's offshore. So comparisons. They're in table 6.3. And actually, not too bad for production. 1,000 megawatts installed and would produce about 2.1 terawatts per year. So that's fairly substantial numbers, but again, when you look at those compared to what the annual energy consumption of the UK is, each one of those is just a really small dent in the overall system. And there's actually a pretty good comparison down there, figure 627, of what these things cost. And you start comparing them. Now, once again, we're not figuring any outside sources. We're only talking about the electricity generated per dollar spent. It doesn't talk, this thing does not talk anything to CO2, environmental damage, social impacts, anything like that. But we can see the cost and how much has to be paid for to make it economic. How much it costs per megawatt hour in order to build these things. And you can see that the lagoon is the highest by far. The barrage is pretty high. You get down to coal with CCS is half of these costs, if not less. Offshore wind is more than half less than these. And nuclear, believe it or not, because we always think of nuclear as being really expensive, nuclear is cheaper than all of them. So, while they seem like a great idea, we're going to have to do something in our technology. We're going to figure out something to bring those costs down. Otherwise, right now, just because it's possible doesn't mean it's realistic or economic to do.
Just need to get a bunch of beavers together. With training beavers.
All right, with that, I'm going to stop the video.